handle the truth.
The Denise Simon Experience. The Truth Matrix. Vetting, exposing, drilling down to the truth.
Rolling Thunder, this is Hitman, Seat, over. Hitman, this is Rolling Thunder, Seat out.
The Denise Simon Experience. Exposing politics, lies, demagoguery, spin, fraud.
Grid to suppress, Mike Charlie, 4 tree 5, 9er 2 1. Grid to mark, Mike Charlie, 4 7 tree 9er, 8 9er, out.
Promoting individual situational awareness. Question, probe, notice, ask why.
Mark smoke on the deck, 2 rounds HEPT, gas TOT 5-3.
And now, the Denise Simon Experience.
And welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Denise Simon Experience. We often talk about legal cases on the Denise Simon Experience, and my friend here, Mark Miller, who's the senior attorney at Pacific Legal Foundation, has been kind enough to join us because we like to follow up on cases. And in this particular one that we're going to discuss, I haven't decided if the frog has won or the frog has lost. But the Supreme Court accepted the case, and I think it was a unanimous decision. But welcome, Mr. Mark Miller, and thanks for being with us on the Denise Simon Experience.
Of course. Thanks for having me on again, Denise.
So did the frog win or lose?
Well, I'm going to tell you that that's entirely the wrong way to look at the case. And
I know.
Your friends, I know I can tell you. This isn't about the frog winning and losing, because either way, the property, it's really about the property owners and the people of Louisiana and all Americans, and whether they won or lost. The frog only wins if he's conserved, if he or she, I suppose, has land that can actually conserve the frog, is the legal term, which is bring it back from the brink of extinction. And this land doesn't do that. And so the land at issue in the case is about whether the government can just deem land habitat for a frog, or any endangered species, even if the endangered species could never live there and would not survive there.
And didn't live there. And so it's not about saving the frog. Everyone wants to save the frog. Save the frogs, save the whales. I mean, there's no question people want to conserve endangered species. That's what the ESA is there for, the Endangered Species Act. This land that the government wants declared critical habitat doesn't do that. And so the question was, do Americans win or lose? Well, in the case, the war is not over in this case, the metaphorical war, but the battle certainly was won by Americans. Yay!
Yes.
I'm pulling your chain about the frog. But here's an interesting thing. You had a private landowner who, maybe refresh my memory, they leased the property, 1,500 acres to Weyerhaeuser?
Exactly.
And so Weyerhaeuser was suing Fish and Wildlife, right?
And the landowners too. Mm-hmm.
Okay, fair enough. All right. And so I watched a little bit of the argument because you guys did such a great job on the video. And I got to tell you, the attorney really struggled. I mean, just really struggled to answer any of the questions by the Supreme Court judges, didn't he?
The attorney meaning the government's attorney.
The government's attorney, yes.
Yes. Yeah, really, it was Chief Justice Roberts who really made the best point by way of a question, which is when he asked the government lawyer, why, if your definition of habitat is correct, then why couldn't the Fish and Wildlife Service declare land in Alaska to be habitat for the frog, and then put a dome over the land and recreate the habitat that this frog in the bayou needs or in Mississippi needs up in Alaska? And the government lawyer could not, or chose not to, give him an answer. He would have thought they'd be ready to make a distinction between Alaska or any place remote and Louisiana, which is remote from the Frog. It's 70 miles away, but not as remote as Alaska. But they weren't willing, the government lawyer was not willing to do that. They don't want any sort of limitation on the government power. And that's really what the case was about. Was this an abuse of government power? And, like I said, the fight's not over, but certainly you read Chief Justice Roberts' opinion for the unanimous 8-justice court, Kavanaugh not having participated, you can see that it's going to be a tough row to hoe for the government to take this case below and win. Of course, I'm not saying the fat lady is sung. We have to litigate it, and we intend to. But, it was certainly a great day for property rights and for our clients, Edward Poitevin, and the private property owners, and, of course, Weyerhaeuser, who leases the property and owns a small piece of it.
Mr. Mark Miller, this case has some age to it, didn't it? If I remember right, it was quite a long ago that this all kind of blew up.
We've had older cases, but you're right. I mean, in terms of the real world, our client was first told in 2011 that his land that had been in the family since Reconstruction well over 100 years was now deeded in all but the legal sense to a frog. And so that's when the legal battle really began, 2011. And he had lost, and Pacific Legal had been representing him all along the way. It was always close. The trial judge had said he did not really like the results, basically. I'm paraphrasing, but he said he didn't think he had a choice. Judge Marty Feldman, federal judge. Then the appeals court, we lost 2-1, where a dissenter said, she thought this was an abuse of power. Then we lost 8-6 when the entire Fifth Circuit, the federal appeals court for Louisiana and Texas and Mississippi, heard the case. And 6 judges disagreed with the majority. And now here we are at the Supreme Court, and we win unanimously, on the idea that the government has pushed its power too far.
Now, Mark, what really happens here? Is there some kind of compensation? Because, Weyerhaeuser and the landowner have been really dead in the water for 6 or 7 years. So is there some kind of, restitution or compensation that goes back to the landowner / Weyerhaeuser?
No, absolutely not. And
wow.
In fact, that's where that expression, you can't fight City Hall, comes from, because here, luckily, Weyerhaeuser has the financial wherewithal to fight the federal government all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. Our landowner, on the other hand, maybe wouldn't have, I'm not going to say, but certainly it made it easier on the family that Pacific Legal Foundation took on their representation because, of course, we work at no charge to our clients. We're a 501c3. So, but yeah, the time, we've had cases, we won a case at the Supreme Court, say 6 years ago, and I managed the attorney fee part of that case. That case, we did have an entitlement to attorney's fees under Florida law. We won at the U.S. Supreme Court 5-4. It was called Kuntz. And we ended up recovering close to $1 million in attorney's fees just for Pacific Legal's work. The attorneys overall on the property owner side won almost $3 million. But here, there is no corresponding attorney fee provision in the law under the Clean Water Act. And so, no, the fees that are expended, the time, the pain, the aggravation, the money that's been spent with Weyerhaeuser and then the local attorneys that Weyerhaeuser had as well and the local lower courts, that's all, money that's out the door and lost because the federal government took this unreasonable, really irrational, I would say, position. And I call it irrational, and I don't use that word lightly. I call it irrational because they don't protect the frog, yet they're demanding the property owner give up their property for the frog, and the land can't help the frog. And to me, that's just per se irrational. It's only rational if you try and figure out what they're really up to, and they're using this case as a stalking horse for other legal efforts they want to make in terms of, I would say, dealing with the fact that Congress hasn't given them tools they need, they think, the environmentalists or the Interior Department, to address climate change or what have you. And so they're trying to take the Endangered Species Act and turn it into a tool that it's not designed to be. Congress did not design it to address what they want.
I guess the reason I was asking about restitution or compensation is because Weyerhaeuser, because they have the financial wherewithal, they could have gone back to this poor landowner and said, you know what, we're going to cancel this contract. We're not going to stay. We don't have the stick-to-itiveness. This 1,500 acres isn't that important to us. They could have bailed out this old boy would have lost the revenue that he had leasing the 1,500 acres to Weyerhaeuser. But interestingly enough, everybody stuck to the game, didn't they?
Everyone stuck to the game, but you really are onto something when you talk about compensation, because in fact, if the federal government wanted to protect the frog, and this is the only way to do it, there's a different tool to protect the frog with this property, and it would be for the federal government under a different provision of the Endangered Species Act. Mm-hmm. They could buy the land. They could pay the landowner, and then it would, and then it would no longer be. And if they paid just compensation for public use, the public use being frog habitat, then there'd be no beef here. The client would, they might fight over costs, what the property is worth, but the government is allowed to do that under the Endangered Species Act, but that's not the tool they went with. Instead, that's a legal tool. Instead, they try to take a different legal tool that doesn't apply and apply it here. And that's why we fought them, because they're not using the right tool. They're not allowed to just label private property critical habitat and expect the property owner to make the dramatic change that the land would need to actually become habitat. That's really what they were trying to do. They can buy it, then they can make it habitat. And then, the frog, I guess, could be moved there, and they've changed the property. And when I say changed, we're talking about a property the size of 2 Central Parks in New York, knock down all the closed canopy trees, the close trees, loblolly trees, it's actually a tree farm, and make it an open canopy forest, so different trees altogether. Think about the cost of that. They then would have to build some upland habitat, because this is basically flat. They need upland habitat the frog needs, and then they've got to nurse these ponds for the frog to lay its eggs. So it's an expensive proposition. And then on top of that, you need to have regular fires to burn up the ground cover, because otherwise the frog can't get to the bugs and such that it eats. So here you're talking about fires. You're talking about changing 2 Central Parks entirely to protect the frog. The landowner's not going to do that. So right now the frog can't live there. So why not just buy the land? I don't know. I don't really, I have speculation about why they did it, but it's not the right tool, and it's why the landowners and Weyerhaeuser fought.
So it boils down to what you have really described is essentially taking property and under really eminent domain, not for the public good, but for a phantom endangered species that's really never been there. So all of this time, there was really eminent domain because the landowner and Weyerhaeuser couldn't use it for a frog that didn't exist.
They won't be able to develop the land, which is what the plan is, if this property is held up as critical habitat, because ultimately it's a tree farm now, but the county, which is called a parish in Louisiana, St. Tammany Parish, and the state intend ultimately for this land to be bought by them, the state, and turned into roads and suburbs for New Orleans. It's on the other side of Lake Pontchartrain. And so a little bit past, obviously there are, Metairie, there are towns on the other side of Lake Pontchartrain in Tammany. But as you get further out, that's, suburbia spreads. And that's where this land is. It's in that first parish right after Lake Pontchartrain on the bridge. And so this is ultimately going to become part of the suburbs of New Orleans, unless the frog has its way, if you will. And really, the federal government has its way. And so it can be, and I don't want to, I'm going to make a change of course from what you said. Congress decided in the 70s whether or not an individual might agree with Congress. The fact of the matter is Congress passed the Endangered Species Act and then amended it to say that protecting critical habitat for a species, even a phantom frog, is a public use. So under the eminent domain powers, you could take the property and say the public use is to protect the frog and then justly compensate the landowners. But that's not what they're doing. They're trying to freeze the property, not allow it to be used, but then not pay either. And that's really PLF's bread and butter, is fighting that kind of rule that doesn't allow you to use your property that may as well be a taking. It's de facto eminent domain, but the government tries to deny that it's doing so because it doesn't want to pay.
So the moment in the Supreme Court when this case was argued, did it almost, in the arguments presented, or the argument, was it almost comical?
Well, no, there are cases like that. There was a case earlier this week that was, in some sense, comical, argued by a similar organization, the Pacific Legal called Institute for Justice, where the legal issue at stake seemed such a no-brainer that all the justices seemed to agree. But here, it seemed to break down 4-4. Kavanaugh had not been confirmed yet. It was the first day of the new term, October 1.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was 8 justices, and every impression people had walking out of that room, walking out of that courthouse, was that this court was pretty evenly split. And, it was a bad sign, you could say, for the landowner, because a split, a tie at 4-4 would go to the government since they won in the lower court.
Right.
And so it's a tribute, in my mind, to Chief Justice Roberts' ability to be a conciliator, that he was a mediator, that he was able to bring in what some people are calling, say, a limited win. I would just call it an outstanding win, because it's a unanimous decision.
Yeah.
And it's saying the lower court got it wrong on 2 different but similarly important issues, both of which end up in our client's favor. And so, I've been reading a biography of Chief Justice John Marshall, our, what some people call our greatest Chief Justice, our greatest judge, and he repeatedly tried to bring in unanimous decisions because he wanted to convey that this is not a left-right issue, or back then a federalist, anti-federalist issue, these legal cases. It's not just about power. There is an abstract law that's being protected. And you sort of convey that better when everybody agrees, on a court, whether it be 8 or 9 or what have you.
This has some interesting implications when it goes back to Fish and Wildlife, I would say, for cases in the future, because I'm sure there's, Weyerhaeuser and the landowner is not the first nor the last. So it has some case history now, not only for Fish and Wildlife, but the private landowners against Fish and Wildlife and EPA, correct?
Yes, because Chief Justice Roberts said, we just said unanimously, the court said that critical habitat has to be habitable, and the lower court had said it didn't. And so now he's remanding it and said, okay, now that it does have to be habitable, tell me if this is habitat for the frog. And so that now applies to any endangered species. The government can no longer take the position that they can set aside property, call it critical habitat, even though it's not habitat at all. In fact, Chief Justice Roberts, in the opinion, gives a little grammar lesson. And it points out that the word critical in the phrase critical habitat is an adjective modifying a noun. And so if the phrase is critical habitat, you have an adjective modifying noun. Well, to have critical habitat, you've got to have habitat, because that's the noun. You can't have critical land that's not habitable, because that's, critical habitat. Habitat is habitable. So it's now going to be up to the lower court to say, if this, is this land habitat, when in fact the frog, 3 of the elements the government concedes are needed for the frog, only one at best is there. You have to change the property to make the other 2 there. And like I said earlier, this is a massive piece of property, 1,544 acres. It's not like, a little back 40 on your farm or something. This is 1,500 acres, 1,544 acres. And we're talking dramatic costs, millions of dollars. I would estimate, which of course the government did not bother even trying to figure out what it would cost to change the property adequately for this frog that can't live there now to somehow live there in the future. Now,
I know you guys don't do politics at all, but this would almost, if anybody in Congress, and I'm not sure that they were, was watching this case or gets the, copy of the decision, it almost seems as though there needs to be some kind of amendment to the Endangered Species Act, correct?
Yeah, I like that idea, Denise, but I don't know if you saw the recent election results. I'm not holding my breath.
I could just put it out there, I could just put it out there.
Yes, I'll wait for the House to bring us a draft on amending the ESA right now. That President Trump would be willing to sign. I'm not confident we're going to see that. I'm just hoping they can figure out how to continue funding the government after the 13th.
Indeed so.
Although they might be better if they didn't. I don't know.
So when Pacific Legal was before the Supreme Court on this particular case, these get argued for what, 30 or 40 minutes each side?
Each side gets 30 minutes. That's right.
Okay. And
so
that includes the questions, correct?
Right. That there's two questions, and there was an hour. Typically, there's an hour, 30 minutes each side. Occasionally, in your real big cases, the Affordable Care, Obamacare case, there was more time. Citizens United, the campaign speech case, that was more time. But this was just your typical 30 minutes each side, and you can ask for a divided argument, but which would have meant that Weyerhaeuser argues and the landowners get to argue, which would have been Pacific Legal. But normally, traditionally, the court's not going to allow that, and they didn't allow it here, which is fine. Obviously, we won 8-0. So, the lawyer who argued for Weyerhaeuser, not surprisingly, is one of the best lawyers in the country, that Weyerhaeuser would retain such an attorney of that respect. And he's someone who clerked at the U.S. Supreme Court. He's argued more than half a dozen times. The Supreme Court has a very good track record. So we were very happy, even though we were disappointed. I was disappointed I didn't get to argue, and my client was disappointed he didn't have his lawyer there. The bottom line is Weyerhaeuser and Pacific Legal Foundation, Weyerhaeuser and the landowners, the family landowners, were basically aligned the same way. And so as long as a good lawyer was making the argument, and as we've seen now with an 8-0 win, a good lawyer was, we're very happy with the result.
So this is all kind of predetermined on the front side, who gets to stand up and do the arguments?
Well, Denise, that's a whole nother show.
Oh,
but it could be. But in fact, just to give a little bit of inside Supreme Court baseball, sometimes it can come down to, I don't put myself up in the level of, say, a Paul Clement, Neil Catchall, the attorneys who we all know who are famous in D.C. who argue regularly in front of the Supreme Court. But if those kind of lawyers are on the same side, it can come down to a coin flip. The Supreme Court will not say, well, gee, you're two big personalities or two giants. I'm going to allow you both to argue. And they'll just say, you figure it out. And it can, at times, come down to a simple coin flip. Yep.
Interesting.
Yes.
Well, I would say circle all the way back to where we began. The frog lost because the frog can never live now on this 1,500 acres, right?
Well, I'm optimistic that the frog won because maybe the government will now start focusing on saving the frog and not turning the screws on our clients. Because really, that's where its focus should be. It's called the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, not the U.S. let's figure out how to take someone's private property for a pointless reason service. So I think the frog won. That's what I think. Okay,
I know the frog won, and I know the landowners won, and I know Pacific Legal won. And I'm really happy with this case. I think some of the judges probably sitting on the Supreme Court when they heard this were just kind of going, what in the world? But, they kind of peeled back the layers and said, the implications are really much bigger. For sure, it's governments versus a landowner who had this land forever. And at some point along the way, the government decided to change the rules on the poor landowner. And hat tip to Pacific Legal, hat tip to Mark Miller, hat tip to Weyerhaeuser, hat tip to the Supreme Court, and hat tip to the frog. How about that?
That sounds good to me. Thank you very much, Denise. I think you covered everybody there.
I did. I tried to. I got to be politically correct all the way around.
Yes, that's it.
Well, thank you, Mr. Mark Miller. And ladies and gentlemen, there's more coming your way, so stay with us.
About to join Don Newen, co-host of Cowboy Logic Radio, and Denise Simon, host of the Denise Simon Experience, for a weekly situation report, or SITREP. 18 hours a day, Denise Simon lives her life as an intel analyst. 18 hours a day, Don Newen lives his life in the world of rock and roll. 1 hour each day, Newen receives a daily SITREP from Simon. Welcome to the Drive Time Situation Report. Fasten your seatbelt. You're now in Don Newen's car, and he is calling in for his SITREP.
Check the Talk America Radio schedules for showtimes at talkamericaradio.us.
Let me talk to you, black people. When you vote for blacks and put them in office under the banner of the Democrat Party, please explain to me what black people get as a result. This was not a nap that we have been taking. We are in a coma. You know what the interesting thing about pensions is? That's today's money given to people who ain't doing nothing for you today. Get off that black Democrat tit that they've been sucking on. Your country is being stolen from you, and the promise is being stolen from your children, and they're telling you it's all right while the rest of the world is trying to lap us. Well, why are we doing so poorly? 2 words: teachers' unions. Are you kidding me?
Black Man Thinking, Monday nights, 9 p.m.
Hi, this is Donna Fiducia, co-host of Cowboy Logic Radio. For 28 years, I was in the mainstream media, most recently as an anchor at the Fox News Channel. No more. Ladies and gentlemen, the mainstream media has completely failed the American people. Radio networks like Talk America Radio will not fail you. Radio shows like Cowboy Logic Radio will not fail you. Check out the entire roster of over 60 weekly radio shows by visiting talkamericaradio.us. That's talkamericaradio.us.
TalkAmericaRadio.us.
Thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for hanging with us here on the Denise Simon Experience. We're going to actually talk about this southern border thing, but we're not going to talk about Tijuana. We're actually going to talk about Hidalgo, Texas, which is, I would say, a frontier that when it comes to the border situation, some selected media outlets talk about it a little. But all the headlines are going to Tijuana. So, Miss Amy Clark has stepped in to join us here on the Denise Simon Experience. She's the media director for Moms for America, and you can find their work at momsforamerica.us. And thank you, Amy, for stepping in, because I think Kimberly was still trying to travel, wasn't she?
Yes, I think she's on her way to the Beltway today, so I don't envy her.
Indeed so. Now, before we get started, you also have a Facebook page, do you not?
Sure, we do. We're Moms for America, and there's also one for the Moms March. And a lot of the stuff I'm going to be talking about today is on our YouTube channel, which is also called Moms March.
All right, I like it. Now, how many moms got up the nerve and the courage to go check out Hidalgo? How many went on this trip?
There were several, close to 24 moms that went, and it was early November, and they traveled down there. And I got to tell you, some of the moms included Karen Vaughn, who's a proud,
I know Karen. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Gold Star mama, and a couple of Fox News contributor moms, Kathy Barnett and Beth Parlata, and of course Kimberly, who's the president of Moms for America, Alicia Owenby of Black Women Walk, and Alice Linehan of Women on the Wall, and it went on, and then of course several angel moms, and we know angel families are the families who've lost someone due to violence caused by an illegal immigrant who has come into this country. So it was quite an experience, and again, I love to direct everybody to our YouTube page. It's Moms March, and Kimberly just uploaded the latest of the videos that came from that, and it is powerful stuff that you are not going to see from any mainstream media outlet.
Now, so you had a variety of moms, coming from different disciplines, and that's good. So it wasn't as though that there was some sort of mission and you guys got to stick to some talking point. I mean, everybody got to see what they, saw and visit and, investigate and research. And I think all of you came away with pretty much the same conclusions, correct?
Yeah, it was amazing. It's like I tell my daughter, if you know what result you want from your science experiment, you're going to wind up getting that result. And that's what our journalists do a lot of times in the mainstream media, right? They know what answer they want to get, and so they go down and skew their research. But these moms went down to the border. One's from D.C., New Jersey, Florida, Texas, Nebraska. They're from all over the country. And they went down and they met with a group of moms, some real border families down there, and a couple of teachers who try to teach in Hidalgo and McAllen. And just the experiences that they had and the concerns that they had are something that all Americans really need to hear about.
Now, how far is Hidalgo from Harlingen?
I would have to look that up. I'm not sure from.
Okay, that was a blindsided question. Sorry.
Yeah, it's a big state. Yes, ma'am. But
I know.
Yeah, that Hidalgo was where they went, and of course, if you remember back in early November, they were talking about the caravan heading up through Texas. Well, we know now that because Texas put up a strong show of support for our border and our border security, and they have been diverted. And also, I think you could easily argue for political reasons, they've been diverted to California. So they're walking, 1,000 miles out of the way, and these they're asylum seekers, right? Supposedly asylum seekers. So I think it's very telling that they circumvented Texas and went the long way to make their point. And of course, it's going to be an easier entry for them than it is in Texas. So
now, Amy, how long were you gals there?
There were 3 days. 3 days. And during that time, they met and they convened with some moms in the community who were really glad to have them. Again, if you watch these videos, how glad these teachers and these mothers were to have somebody there who was documenting the real story of what they face. So they did some interviews, and of course those are up on our website, on our YouTube channel. But they talked to some teachers of some elementary schools, so people who are trying to do their best for kids every single day right there on the U.S. side of the border with Mexico. And they talk about having lockdown drills to prepare them for when the school is a lockdown, when drug runners approach the school or just illegal aliens. They say that the people crossing know the timing of the school bells, and they try to integrate into the crowds to not be seen. Obviously, the untold story and something that should strike fear in the heart of everyone is sex trafficking. And that is real, and it is prevalent. And what happens over the border, and these children that are so-called, being brought over by their families, a lot of times they're not with their family at all. And unfortunately, that is a prevalent thing that happens in that border situation. And so that's an obvious concern of the mothers that live there on the border. Stray bullets, right? Kimberly tells the story of while they were standing right there talking to some of the teachers, here comes some people out of the brush behind them. And one of the moms started talking to them, found out that they were from El Salvador. So it's not just, again and again, we hear that the stories that it's just people looking for, coming up from Mexico, looking for a better life, but these are people coming from deep in Central America, obviously from other places too, trying to come up through the poorest part of our border.
But not all of these that are coming across are from Mexico or Central America. I mean, there are, what do they call, other than OPM, other than Mexican, correct? Or at this point, other than OTL, other than Latinos, correct?
Yes, and I mean, that was not, on their 3 days there, I don't know that is something that was experienced. They did experience people coming who were not from Mexico, who were actually from, like I said, El Salvador, just as they were standing there. But certainly we've seen with the caravan that not everybody is who they say they are, and not everybody certainly is seeking asylum. In fact, many of the people interviewed by journalists everywhere, people in that migrant caravan don't ever use the word asylum. They say, hey, yeah, we're coming to look for jobs. So
when, during these 3 days, Amy, and having these conversations with, people of various backgrounds and professional positions, Did they offer any kind of solutions, or were they just telling the chilling stories?
Well, for the most part, trying to express their stories and the frustration that nobody listens to them, the solution obviously is for our government to take securing the border seriously, and for the American public to not just listen to one side of the story, but try to hear, who better to listen to than the families who live on the border. These are American families. These are our neighbors, right? Our fellow Americans living on the border, and the troubles they face, and the reality of their everyday situation, and their fear for their own security. A lot of times they're concerned for their jobs and their communities because of the influx of illegal aliens coming and taking the resources and taking the jobs. And as they move on into the country, oftentimes, for somebody who's willing to cross the border illegally, who's to say that they will suddenly obey the law once they're here? And I think that that's a valid question. And these are all questions that these families are asking. But it is a shame that this issue, like everything else, becomes so politicized, and the people who are literally in the crossfire are the ones whose voices are completely ignored.
I was in D.C. a couple of months ago on a kind of a immigration summit for 3 days. And so I interviewed an awful lot of people for radio during those 3 days, and a couple of them were ranchers that live on the border. And what's particularly interesting is that those ranchers have been told that they cannot, I don't know how to really, they can't shoot. They can defend themselves, but they can't take any proactive measures. I mean, they've been really hamstrung. So it's kind of like they can protect the house, but they can't really protect the property.
Right. And certainly we value, the humanity of all people, right, and the dignity of all people, and certainly appreciate that. But at the same time, when you're a mama standing on your back porch and someone is threatening your children and your home, your mama bear instincts are going to get kicked in.
Indeed.
And so to what extent, that's right, can you protect your home and your property? I live in Texas. I'm a good ways from the border, but I have friends who live down in border country, and they have those automatic locking doors. They cannot walk outside to their vehicle without having their door locked, and they have a combination, so they don't always have to have a key. But you can't. Swimming pools that told the border mom caravan about swimming pools had to be drained because illegal aliens are using it to bathe in, and water left on, and not on and on. And of course, those may seem silly stories to other people, but if you're sitting in your suburban Pennsylvania, that's not a problem that you face. And there needs to be empathy and understanding and listening. The left loves to call for empathy for all these other situations. But again, here we have these border families, just doing their best and trying to take their kids to school. And you mentioned the ranchers. These are ranchers that have been in the families for
legacy
generations.
Yeah.
Our actual border of this country is being ceded in some places to illegal immigrants because it cannot be defended because of geography or the way that the drug cartels are coming over, in the instances where that's really bad, that it can't be defended, or it won't be defended. And so it is shocking to me when they try to portray this group of people, and now I just read yesterday that it's swollen to almost 7,500
I did too.
people, coming to our border, and they laugh when we call it an invasion. So
okay, then change the name. Let's call it an insurgency. How about that?
Right. Yes, exactly. What would you like to call it? But anybody in a large group who's trying to rush our border should be something of tremendous concern.
Well, and I would say that these, people like you and people that live on the border, doing whatever they do in their normal lives, if I would put them in a press conference and I'd turn around and say to the, Jim Acosta's, hey, dude, I know that you want to have some sympathy for these people. We all do. But what about the sympathy for us? Because this kind of life has rocked our world. It wasn't this way 50, 60 years ago, and it's just only gotten worse. And so we have to live a very different model of life than we once lived. And where's the sympathy for how we've had to alter our daily routines, correct?
Absolutely 100%. And I think you can look at it in two ways. Number one is the security issue, and that should be a concern for all Americans. Now, to say that is not saying that everybody who crosses our border is a bad person. Nobody's saying that. But isn't it right that we would want to know who's coming into our country? I want to know who's coming into my home, right? I wouldn't just let a random open the door and let a random stranger into my home. Who are you? Who are you with? Where are you from? So it's equally as important for people entering our country. What we're asking is get in line, let's fill out the paperwork, come through the legal port of entry, and talk about who you are and why it is that you're coming to this country so that we can all be secure. And secondly, the fact that if people come over here and they are taking the resources meant for American citizens and they're taking jobs meant for American citizens, and we're beginning to see, right, in some parts of the country that there's manufacturing job losses. So we have to ask ourselves, where's the sympathy, right? Obviously, it's a political, right now it's the political win to be on this side, but where is the sympathy for these Americans? Yes. Why don't you talk to the Americans or the angel families? Talk about somebody who never gets interviewed. I've
interviewed a couple of them, and I've been with them a couple of years in a row. I'm going to change gears and kind of circle back on these teachers that, Amy, these teachers can't even teach, can they? They can't teach to the standard. In other words, that education system in that region in and around Hidalgo is not teaching the same kind of syllabus that you would be teaching in Tulsa, Oklahoma, would it?
Well, I wouldn't think so, while they were being constantly interrupted by lockdown drills. And this is fourth grade. I neglected to mention that. It was a fourth grade teacher who told the story of lockdown drills. So imagine then, them going home and having to talk to their parent about why they did this. They told the Moms Caravan that, that, again, sex trafficking is a huge issue. They live in fear of their children, not just their children, but the children that they're teaching, right? All teachers see the kids in their classroom as their children. They live in fear that while they're at the school, that they could be taken. Again, like I said, they try to blend in with the school bell closing. This group of people who had crossed behind them, Kimberly told the story that they tried to blend in with the moms group, right? And just kind of go down the street that way. But Border Patrol's there. They had to call Border Patrol once when these people came up to them as they were meeting with these moms, and they were there very, very quickly. But the point is it's an ongoing thing. And if you go just shortly down the way to the border control checkpoints, I'm almost speechless. It's gut wrenching, the stories they tell of the scenes that you can see portrayed, the beer bottles and I don't want to get into it, but you can go and you can watch the videos and they talk about, but the crimes against women. And that's, again, if anybody was in support of truly women's rights, they would be trying to stop the sex trafficking and the sex abuse that happens when single women try to cross the border. They are assaulted and taken advantage of, and there is nobody there to protect them.
So we've had a couple of school shootings, obviously, and you just spoke about the measures that the school system in Hidalgo has to take with the lockdowns and all those other kinds of things. It would almost seem to be a model that other schools should necessarily pay attention to and maybe modify those models in order for school safety really across the country. Is that overstating it?
I think to some extent, the threat would be a different threat. I know that is the topic in school districts all across America, is how to handle school security and prevent active shooter situations. And it's a frightening thing that we even have to have that conversation. But I agreed, to some extent, school security is school security, and that is something that they could look at. But I think the most important thing that we teach the children is that you prepare so that you know what to do, and then you live your life and you don't live in fear. And any situation that causes children to live in fear is certainly a disservice and worse to the child. And I think that's something as we adults have to be, when I was growing up, it was tornado drills because I lived in Tornado Alley, and but you went in the restroom and you covered the back of your neck and the bell went off, and then you came out and you didn't ever think about it again. And obviously that's not the world we're living in right now, but I think the ultimate goal is to not only keep our children safe and secure, but also teach them they don't have to live in fear, because that's not the America that we know.
Okay, so Amy Clark and the rest of you have been impaneled to give some testimony before the Congressional Committee on Department of Homeland Security. What are you going to share with them? I mean, you just going to show them the video, or are you going to get it there and put your hands on your hips and stomp your feet and include the media and say, stop distorting these real truths? I mean, I want a televised congressional hearing with you gals. If not, I want a documentary. You know what I mean? I mean,
absolutely. And that is
what you're
something
saying
Moms
is
for America
chilling.
is working this very minute on putting together the documentary from this footage. They're hoping to go back down in the next month or so and to get a little bit more footage and interview some more people and present a holistic picture. As far as when Kimberly goes before and testifies on that, there won't be stomping of feet. We know we know that is not the way to be heard, is to yell
I
more
was
loudly.
being snarky.
Of course, but the way to be heard. But you make a good point, because that is how some people react. But you don't get your point across through a megaphone, right? You get your point across through speaking the truth steadily and constantly, and that's what we're trying to do with Moms for America on multiple issues, but especially on this issue here. Wake up, moms, pay attention. Don't buy what they're selling to you, the politically skewed version. Hey, there was a great example on MSNBC. They had a reporter, and the show started off, and they said, "Isn't it this way?" And then they flashed to the reporter, and he actually gave a great example of what was really going on. Yeah, it's mostly men, despite what people say. Yeah, you know what? They're not here for asylum. They're here for jobs. And it was amazing watching it that they didn't accidentally pull his microphone, right, or take him offline.
Yes.
He completely went against their narrative. You can find it. We've got it up on our webpage. But the point is, the story needs to be told, and it needs the people on the border, the families, the mothers on the border, need their voices heard. So I know Moms for America takes it very seriously that these moms have trusted us with their story, and we certainly hope and pray to do a good work and portraying that to the rest of the nation.
So here's the big question then, Amy, and I'm sure you've talked to Kimberly Fletcher about it too, but when these politicians, when the Democrat politicians, even the Republicans for that matter, and even some in the news media, when they just say, okay, we're going to go check out this border thing, as you somewhat described, most of that ends up being staged, because they're not talking to those school teachers, and they're not talking to those ranchers, and they're not talking to those people that, are in the grocery store every day in Harlingen or Hidalgo, correct? I mean, you're telling a very, very different story than what we're being sold here.
That's right. That's right. And anybody can contrive a story, but I'll tell you, they went down there with a couple contacts, and her exact words to her contacts down there were, and one of them was a school teacher, would you find us some moms we can talk to? We don't want media moms. We don't want people who are professional speakers or journalists or in politics. These aren't people who are trying to skew an election one way or the other. We're past the election, So the point of this is to hear the real voices of the moms down there on the border and the people living it, and of course the angel families as well, who have such a powerful story to tell. So anything can be politicized, anything can be skewed, but it has always been incumbent upon the American people to be an educated electorate, right? To seek out the truth, to read different sources of news, and to discern the politics in a situation, right? If common sense were common, we'd be in a lot better position, but it's not. That we have to keep appealing to the logic and the reason, and even, to use the left tactic, the sympathies of people. Okay, here are the sad stories. And in none of this do we lose the humanity that there are people hurting in other countries. Absolutely, 100%. And that is something I pray for every day. And I am thankful that I live in a country that people would fight to get into. And I don't take that for granted. That means the world to me. But because of that, I want to preserve that for my children and my children's children and my neighbors' children, right? And the people of Texas and beyond's children. And I think that it is so important that we remember we can do what we can do, and the rights of the people are the citizens of this country, and that belongs to them, and that's our heritage, and it is our future. And I look at the debt clock. I'm sure you look at that every once in a while. This morning it was at $21.8 trillion, and that is $178,000 per taxpayer. And I would ask the question to anybody who says we should just open the border and let these people in. We are already in debt, $178,000 per taxpayer. That's more than people make in years, right? The average American. So where does the money come from? Where do the jobs come from? Where do the resources come from, if not out of the pocketbooks of our fellow Americans? And it's not a sustainable model. And if we let 7,500 people just walk across the border today, what is it going to be tomorrow?
Well, I'm a big proponent of, in a high tide, all boats rise. And the matter of El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Honduras, and the rest of them, this is a model. I mean, those countries have been failing for a very long time. And there was a time in our own history that we worked diligently to ensure that countries didn't go into a tailspin. And I think it's almost past the point of no return in some of these countries. And so I think there are some other real solutions that we can certainly help these countries, such that they're come across the border would find a reason to stay. We need to give them a reason to stay. And I think it would be, I think there would be a return on that investment, because we wouldn't continue to degrade our own infrastructure with bringing all these people in here, correct?
Oh, right. No, I agree. And in fact, what we're able to give them when they come in is certainly not the America that they're dreaming of, right? When we're trying to process people and pull them in. But I agree, Denise, that, there are ways that we could go about it through education, through training, through cooperatives, right? Through private organizations, right? Not the government is not always the answer. Through private organizations to try to encourage entrepreneurship in these other countries. But, we have to look, going back to the philosophy of their government, and there is no better example than Venezuela. It's hot and hip right now to be a progressive socialist, but, all it takes is one glance over to our, to the neighbors down south in Venezuela to see what that type of system has done, or even in the EU. And you look at some of those countries that have allowed unfettered migration into their countries, and what it is doing, not only to their culture, but to their economy as well. And so I think you have to look at history, right? And if you don't study history, we're doomed to repeat it. But politics is not meant to be embraced on an emotional level. We cannot make our laws. We cannot deal with policy based on emotion. We have to look at logic and reason. And
that's right. And those countries, if there's any truth to an awful lot of these people in the caravans that they want to come here and work, then I would say that those countries are having what I would call a labor drain. In other words, you got people that, if there's truth to it, they want to work, and they're leaving their home country. So who's going to do any kind of labor there unless there's some enticement for them to come back? Ladies and gentlemen, we've been speaking with Amy Clark, who's the media director for Moms for America. Make sure that you go over to their YouTube channel, Moms March, and to their Facebook page. We are so, so grateful for the honesty here. And I'm going to tap you on the shoulder again, either you or Kimberly, because I think there needs to be a follow-up to this one. And Amy, thanks so much.
Thank you, Denise, for having me on.
My pleasure, ladies and gentlemen. There's more coming your way, so stay with us.
You can't handle the truth. The Denise Simon Experience. The Truth Matrix. Vetting, exposing, drilling down to the truth.
Rolling Thunder, this is Hitman. Seat over. Hitman, this is Rolling Thunder. Seat out.
The Denise Simon Experience. Exposing politics, lies, demagoguery, spin, fraud.
Grid to suppress. Mike Charlie, 4 tree 5, 9er 2-1. Grid to mark. Mike Charlie, 4-7 tree 9er, 8-9er, out.
Promoting individual Situational awareness. Question, probe, notice, ask why.
Mark smoke on the deck, 2 rounds AGPT, gas TOT 53.
And now, the Denise Simon Experience.
Thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for hanging with us here on the Denise Simon Experience. Well, we're going to go find out what in the heck is the matter with Michigan. And Christina Martin has been kind enough to join us with Pacific Legal Foundation. And I would say there's a couple of cases up there that really have me shaking my head, because I would think that there are some pieces of paper that the counties should be sending to some of these landowners. So, Christina, help us with this. You got 2 cases. I think they're both in Oakland County, Michigan. Is that right?
Yeah, well, sort of, yeah. I've got 2 clients in Oakland County, and then I have another case over in Van Buren County, Michigan, with 3 clients there in a different case. But the case you're thinking about, yeah, I've got 2 clients in Oakland County who, one of them accidentally underpaid his property taxes by only $8.41.
Mm-hmm.
And he paid all his subsequent years of taxes on time in full, and then was shocked when in 2014 the county foreclosed on his property to collect the $8 debt plus about $280 in penalties and interest and fees, and they sold the property for $25,000 and kept all the money.
Okay, whoa. So this this landowner, he didn't get a piece of paper or lots of pieces of paper in the mail that said, "Hey, dude, you're behind $8.41." He didn't get a piece of paper that said your house is going up for sale. I mean, there had to be some paperwork traffic here somewhere, right?
There was paperwork, yes. But for whatever reason, he didn't get the notice. So what initially happened was he thought he had paid his 2011 property taxes fully. Finds out, I want to say it was 2 years later, that he had a delinquency. It wasn't a big delinquency. He tried to pay it in full, but the interest kept accruing. So he accidentally underpaid by $8.41. Well, he thinks he's caught up, and, continues paying each of his subsequent year's taxes. And then in 2014, makes his first tax payment for the year. And it was actually after the property was foreclosed. So he no longer even owns it, according to the county. But the county says they sent him notices, and the public record suggests that they did send notices, but he didn't get it. He didn't live at the property. He was renting this out to a family. And, we're not talking about a big time renter or anything like that. He owned 2 rental properties, and this was the more valuable of the 2. He paid $60,000 for it in 2011 and fixed it up and was renting it out. But they sent notice to the property itself and to the address they had for him, but for whatever reason, he didn't receive the notice. And otherwise, obviously, he would have paid his property taxes.
Okay. Here's another head scratcher for me. When you have your tax bill comes due on your property taxes, they send you the bill, so you can pay it. Now, I'm assuming that he owned the property outright. Otherwise,
that's right.
It gets paid for in your mortgage.
Sure.
And so was this property under lease the entire time?
Was he renting it out? He was renting it out to this family, yes. And why he didn't get notice, it's not totally clear. He was getting the subsequent bills, but apparently the county doesn't reflect that a prior year delinquency on your most recent tax bill. And so he's logging in, and because they've got an electronic payment system, logging in and paying the bill. But unaware that there's this $8.41 due for a previous year. And of course, the county doesn't have an incentive to do a good job giving people notice, because in Michigan, they sell the property and they keep all the proceeds. And that is I mean, there's so many problems with that, but the most obvious one here is it doesn't give them an incentive to really do a good job of avoiding foreclosures in the first place, particularly if the property is nice and worth something, because they can sell it and boost their general fund. And that's exactly what they're doing.
Christina, was there a judge involved in any of this when the county had to go and say, okay, we now outright own the property because we've taken it for back taxes? And then did a judge kind of look at this $8.41 and go, what? I mean, what did that ever happen?
They don't look at the specifics. They bundle the foreclosures all together. And when they tried to, when they later tried to undo the sale, undo the foreclosure, obviously that wasn't, the judge didn't buy it because the county followed what's required by law, and they shouldn't have to do anything more than that. And of course, if they didn't have that incentive, again, to foreclose on properties, any reasonable treasurer, any reasonable tax collector would not foreclose.
Yes. Pay it themselves even. I'd pay $8.41.
Me too, yeah. Me too,
okay,
happily.
So obviously the property was worth more than $25,000, but the house sold for about $25,000 under the tax foreclosure, correct?
Right. Yeah, that's right.
And so I would think that they owe him $25,000 less $8.41 plus interest.
At minimum, yeah. So the Fifth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution requires that when government take your property for a public use, that they have to pay you just compensation. And as we've explained to the Michigan Supreme Court, and we've argued elsewhere, that when the government takes your property to collect an overdue tax bill, it's for the public purpose of collecting taxes, and they are allowed to sell that property, and they're allowed to keep statutory penalties, interest, and fees. But to swallow the remainder of a person's equity in their property is a violation of the Constitution. And Michigan has a similar provision that's even more protective than the U.S. Constitution. And so we've asked the Michigan Supreme Court to consider whether it might be a taking for the county to keep that $25,000 instead of refunding the remainder after taking them. It's like $288 in interest, penalties, taxes, fees. That they have a constitutional responsibility to refund the surplus in it. And for that matter, they have a responsibility to sell it for its fair market value as a foreclosure.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, granted, the moment a property becomes a foreclosure, it loses value. So, whether it's sold for a reasonable foreclosure value or not is another matter. But the baseline, the minimum, is that they should at least refund that surplus profit that they made plus interest.
And you have another case of another fella whose property was sold for $82,000. How much below fair market value was that one?
It's pretty significant. But again, the moment a property becomes a foreclosure, it does lose value. So, so we're not at this point. We're not contesting that. But we have some similar cases across the state too, with property owners who had really pretty valuable property. In fact, I represented a church that owned two parcels, and selling just one of the parcels would have been sufficient to pay the church's debt. But the county foreclosed on both parcels and made an arm and a leg. They sold it for over $100,000, and the debt, I want to say, was $6,000, something like that. It was trivial compared to what they made in the sale, and they could have made that by just foreclosing on one parcel, but that's not how it works in Michigan, and they've turned it into a mechanism for profit at the expense of people who are struggling to pay their bills.
So this isn't exclusive to just one county. I mean, you mentioned, Christina, that it's happened in and around the state, correct?
Oh, that's right. The whole state. The Michigan General Property Tax Act explicitly allows counties to foreclose on property when the property becomes delinquent. And then once they actually sell the property, they're required by the statute to keep all the surplus proceeds from these sales. So, they have some discretion, I think, in undoing the foreclosure and giving the property owner additional time to pay the bill and whatnot. Many of the counties don't use that discretion, but once they sell the property, the tax law requires them to keep that profit. And so we're challenging that requirement and saying it's unconstitutional, that there is a constitutional responsibility for the government after tacking on penalties and interest and fees. They can keep all that, but they can't take what's, for most people, their life savings, that equity in their home, their land, their business.
Goodness. So now the good news is that the Supreme Court has agreed to hear the appeal. When does that happen?
The Michigan Supreme Court has agreed to hear the appeal, and that will our first brief's due in January. I'm not sure when oral argument will be. It won't be scheduled till briefing's completed, but that'll be in 2019. And the Michigan Supreme Court will have that opportunity to decide whether it is a violation of the federal constitution or the state constitution. And hopefully they'll get this one right. Most states don't do what Michigan's doing. Most states don't profit at the expense of people that they're evicting. Only a handful of states do that. And so we're hoping that the Michigan Supreme Court will correct that.
Well, it also would seem that the state legislature ought to change something here too, right? I know you know.
You're right. They should. They totally should change that. And the treasurers obviously would be opposed to changes because they're finding this current scheme quite profitable. But in the interest of justice and following the Constitution, they really should change the law.
Essentially, they're stealing equity that's not theirs.
That's exactly right.
And not only, I guess, is it equity, but in the case of these two landlords or this landlord particularly, it has destroyed for him future income. Correct?
That's correct. Yeah, and for some people, I know of people who've lost their homes because of this law. And so then you ask, well, are they going to require government assistance because they've now been evicted from their home? And in many cases, that's exactly what happens. They end up needing additional government assistance, government subsidized housing. Particularly in the cases of elderly people, they end up in a retirement facility. And it's a very unfair system that has consequences that ultimately also end up hurting the general budget because you're having to pay to house people who once had homes.
This is kind of a sidebar perhaps to this, but the person that ended up buying the house after it was foreclosed for $25,000, does he or does that person get a voice in this case?
No. They're not involved in this lawsuit. We're not going after them. And ultimately the issue is what the government is doing, not who they're selling it to or what happens after that. We're trying to end that incentive for government to be foreclosing on people and doing a lousy job letting them know, or just the bare minimum constitutionally required job, I guess you could even say. They should if there were proper incentives in place, I think that you'd be seeing fewer foreclosures in Michigan.
So what does Michigan have to say that they have the right to keep this money? What was their part of the argument?
Well, they argue that in this case, in the Court of Appeals, they argued that it was a civil asset forfeiture. Now, remember, civil asset forfeitures are traditionally linked to crimes. So we're used to hearing about those with drug dealers, especially where the drug dealer loses their car or where they were dealing drugs from, or the drug den that they owned. And or the money that they made from the selling of drugs. That's usually where we hear about civil asset forfeiture these days. But there is no crime involved in failing to pay your property taxes in full, in Michigan at least. maybe somewhere, not in Michigan. And there would obviously be constitutional problems if a failure to pay your property taxes were a crime, because it's not like paying your income taxes. It's different because you just have, like, you're not doing anything to accrue that responsibility. You're just living in the property, or rather owning the property. And so there'd be issues with that, but it's not a crime. And yet somehow they've decided that they can apply this area of the law that's traditionally applied to criminal activity to non-criminal activity. They say, well, it hurts the general welfare if people don't pay their property taxes. That's true. People should pay their taxes in full. They should pay their taxes on time. But there's just something fundamentally different.
Well, it would almost seem that, counties can write off certain kinds of debts, owed to the county. I think it happens, from bad contractors and, those kinds of things. So it would almost seem to be that there might be some threshold here that $200 or less, and we're not even going to bother with it. You know what I'm saying? I mean, but $8.41 is ridiculous.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Well, I would say, you've got what, a half a dozen cases in the state?
Less than that, but yeah, we've got several clients in the state, a couple cases, and there's more. There's many more cases that I have read about, that I've heard stories, anecdotal stories about, and it's not just impoverished people that this is even happening to. It's regular people, it's people who would pay their bills if they knew it happened, or who have been, they were paying their bills, but they end up in the hospital, and elderly people who have mental incompetency. It's people who die and their estate takes over the bill, but this stuff it's happening to people across the state, and a lot of tragic stories are coming from it, and it really should stop. They need to adopt changes, but ultimately we'd like to win in the Michigan Supreme Court so that a legislature doesn't have the discretion to adopt this kind of unconstitutional law.
So this all comes under it would seem that there'd have to be a wider look or a deeper look into the civil asset forfeiture clauses in the state, or any state, because I know there's been some colossal abuses of civil asset. I read about them and I just kind of shake my head. The feds did that and they got the wrong person, but they're still not giving their stuff. Something's just very wrong here. Does some of this direction come from the Department of Justice, or is this really just all at a state level?
Well, this is at a state level. The issue with these tax collections is it is totally coming from the local state and state law, but ultimately they're applying an area of the law that the Supreme Court has expressed concern about in the past, and it's so far beyond what civil asset forfeiture used to be applied to. So if you go back far enough, it was applied to pirate ships and
debtor's prison.
It was applied to, it was applied to property that, like ships that would come and violate the law, and you didn't have jurisdiction over the owner of the property because they're, on the other side of the ocean. And so they would seize the ship. And that was a way to keep people from, especially people who did not live in the United States, from violating the law. And that was, that's just one example, but we're so far afield from what the original conception of civil asset forfeiture was in the United States. I think the Supreme Court's even taken notice, and hopefully in the near future we'll see some serious limitations put on. I know some states have adopted limitations, but hopefully we'll see broader limitations on these sorts of laws.
Yeah, much more defined for sure, because the civil asset forfeiture goes from the sublime to the ridiculous. I know you probably see more of that than I do, but the few that I've seen just in the news media are really head shakers. And I would think that there should be some real challenges even coming or to the Department of Justice when it comes to this. So there's some kind of standard that, I hope you're okay with the ambulance.
Yeah, I was just driving right by.
that some of these states would necessarily take some notice. I mean, because it's takings, it's really stealing equity. I don't know how else to put it, whether it be a piece of property or something else like an automobile, correct?
Sure. Yeah. I think there's obvious incentive problems when government can take property in this manner. And
so
there's a case pending in the Supreme Court right now. It's called Timms versus Indiana, where the Supreme Court will be deciding whether to incorporate the excessive fines clause against the states. And what that means is, does the Eighth Amendment, which provides the protection against excessive fines, does that restrain states or just the federal government? And they had oral argument just the other day, and it seemed pretty clear the Supreme Court is poised to adopt that. And so perhaps we'll be seeing some more meaningful limitations imposed on asset forfeiture. But we don't think that this case, the taking of property over an $8 debt, qualifies in that area of the law. We think it's a taking in violation of the Just Compensation Clause of the Constitution.
Even the IRS, when you don't pay all of your taxes and you're in some kind of trouble, you can work out a deal with them. I mean, they have the authority to seize property too, but in a lot of cases, you owe $10,000 and you can whittle things down to 50 cents on the dollar. So, I mean, even some part, the law's all over the place, and they kind of overlap and they contradict. And I guess that's really what I'm seeing here. I don't know. I can just about imagine how many cases there are beyond Michigan. There are a number of other states that do something similar. A handful of states are actually allow the government to profit at people's expense, and then there's several other states that actually invite private investors to come in and be the one who's profiting. In other words, they sell the right to collect the tax to a private investor, and then if the person doesn't pay that tax plus all the interest and penalties and whatnot, then that investor gets all the surplus equity in that property. They take the entire title, and that raises similar constitutional questions. We don't see a whole lot of those cases being raised yet, but it definitely raises serious constitutional problems, and hopefully we'll see some in the near future. Yeah, you're definitely on the edge of some very interesting arguments here that have some wide consequences. Ladies and gentlemen, big, huge applause to Christina Martin at Pacific Legal for doing this kind of work and explaining these things. I have a feeling that this will be very consequential, not only just in Michigan, but once it happens for many other states. So with that, Christina, thanks so much for being with us. And ladies and gentlemen, there's more coming your way, so stay with us.
About to join Don Newen, co-host of Cowboy Logic Radio, and Denise Simon, host of the Denise Simon Experience, for a weekly situation report, or SITREP. 18 hours a day, Denise Simon lives her life as an intel analyst. 18 hours a day, Don Newen lives his life in the world of rock and roll. 1 hour each day, Newen receives a daily SITREP from Simon. Welcome to the Drive Time Situation Report. Fasten your seatbelt. You're now in Don Newen's car, and he is calling in for his SITREP.
Check the Talk America Radio schedules for showtimes at talkamericaradio.us.
Let me talk to you, black people. When you vote for blacks and put them in office under the banner of the Democrat Party, please explain to me what black people get as a result. This was not a nap that we have been taking. We are in a coma. You know what the interesting thing about pensions is? That's today's money given to people who ain't doing nothing for you today. Get off that black Democrat tit that they've been sucking on. Your country is being stolen from you, and the promise is being stolen from your children, and they're telling you it's all right while the rest of the world is trying to lap us. Well, why are we doing so poorly? 2 words: teachers' unions. Are you kidding me?
Black Man Thinking, Monday nights, 9 p.m.
Hi, this is Donna Fiducia, co-host of Cowboy Logic Radio. For 28 years, I was in the mainstream media, most recently as an anchor at the Fox News Channel. No more. Ladies and gentlemen, the mainstream media has completely failed the American people. Radio networks like Talk America Radio will not fail you. Radio shows like Cowboy Logic Radio will not fail you. Check out the entire roster of over 60 weekly radio shows by visiting talkamericaradio.us. That's talkamericaradio.us.
TalkAmericaRadio.us.
Can we do it again? I like it.
Thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for hanging with us here on the Denise Simon Experience. Khashoggi and the Saudis. Khashoggi and the Saudis. We seem to keep, I don't know, the topic just seems to stay out there. So my old buddy, Mr. Sam Faddis, former CIA editor-in-chief over at And magazine, and I guess you're called a host or a owner or a star on Ground Truth, a podcast covering a whole variety of topics. So, Mr. Sam, welcome to the Denise Simon Experience.
Thank you, ma'am. It's a pleasure to be here as always.
Okay, look, everybody's mad at the Saudis. Everybody's mad at Mohammed bin Salman. I don't like it either, and I'm not particularly a friend of the Saudi kingdom. I think they're doing some good things, and they've tried to do some good things on behalf of the United States, but everything seems to come with some kind of ball and chain scandal attached. And our friend here, Mr. Khashoggi, who was obviously murdered, that I think Erdogan is exploiting all of this for his own elevation against the Saudi kingdom, apparently was a contributing op-ed writer at the Washington Post. He has a bad history, but he's dead, and everybody wants to punish the kingdom now. Is that the right thing to do here, Mr. Sam, in your estimation?
No, I think it's crazy. I think it's counterproductive. I mean, I agree with basically everything you've said. I mean, I don't think any of us are happy that this happened or approve of it. But let's just deal with reality. You know, I mean, start anywhere you want. Khashoggi was no great friend, frankly, of the United States, of the Saudis, of our allies. This is a guy who was horribly upset when Osama bin Laden was killed, to give you an idea of where his sympathies lie. Erdogan in Turkey is clearly exploiting the whole thing for his own political purposes, and he's increasingly no friend of ours either. Saudis are not perfect. Like you, I had many differences with them over the years. But in the scheme of things, in that part of the world, with the allies we have and the enemies we have, kicking the Saudis to the curb and burning our relationship with them to the ground is really, really counterproductive for American national security, which ought to be the centerpiece of everything. So we can have whatever conversations we want to have candidly in private. And I'm not saying we shouldn't do anything, but trashing this relationship or fundamentally altering it, the only thing that's going to do is hurt us and make people like the Iranians cheer, the Ayatollahs cheer in the streets. They would love to see this thing be turned to those purposes.
But here, I guess, you're former CIA, so, I mean, you have an inroads, obviously, to some of the history of CIA that had been ordered to do a lot of things in foreign countries. So you guys get to know a lot of backstories that we will never know. Hence, a lot of it obviously is classified. But if we were to punish every leader of every country for ordering the death and or murder of somebody, some dignitary, some important person, we'd be punishing an awful lot of people out there, including Russia, including China, including Lebanon. I mean, the list goes on forever. Venezuela. I mean, it goes on forever. So it's kind of like, where is all the outrage for all of those other human rights abuses? And isn't it interesting that Bashar al-Assad has not even been in the headlines in 6 months?
Yeah, well, I mean, I agree completely. I mean, look at the Iranians to start with. The Iranians on a regular basis are killing people in vast numbers all over the planet who are opponents of the regime. Just in Iraq, they have recently started a targeted assassination campaign where, using the Iranian Revolutionary Guards and agents of theirs, they are killing Iraqi politicians who have the audacity to resist the Iranians' efforts to turn Iraq into a puppet state. They hunt down and kill dissidents all the time. One of the guys who's been on Ground Truth with me in the last few months, J.J. Bakhtiari, is the grandson of the last prime minister of the Shah's last prime minister, I should say. J.J. is at an undisclosed location when he talks to us because he has literally been hunted his entire adult life and is still hunted every day by Iranian assets. No joke, he will be killed in a hideous and horrible fashion if he's found tomorrow. Mm-hmm. So this is the reality of the world. Again, I'm not making excuses for the Saudis, with whom I have had many differences over the years. But this is the context in which we are all of a sudden taking the killing of Khashoggi and turning it into something that should break our relationship. I mean, I think, in addition to being reprehensible that they killed him, I think it's one of the dumbest things.
It's pretty sloppy.
I mean, it's horribly sloppily done. But again, I'm not ignoring the moral issue, if you will, here. But from a question of policy, here's a guy that the day before he was killed, most Americans couldn't even remember ever hearing his name. And now, even though they may not know who he is, probably most Americans are very familiar with the fact that Khashoggi was killed. They transformed him into a martyr by killing him.
Yes.
They also ignored the fact that he had, by virtue of working for the Washington Post and so forth, in effect become a U.S. person. And I'm not focused on the legalities. It's just, he is now somebody that, whether they liked it or not, kind of was associated with the United States of America. And therefore, when you kill somebody like that, it puts the American president in a very tough position. I mean, this is kind of like once upon a time, if you killed a citizen of Rome, no matter what the Romans thought, you kind of just started trouble with us, because we can't have the principle that you can attack our people at will. We end up in situations all the time where we're standing up for some American citizen in some remote corner of the world, and all you can think is, for the love of God, why are you there? And why would you put yourself in this situation? But that's who we are. So, Khashoggi wasn't really that, but by virtue of working for the Post, he had kind of become that. And all of that in Riyadh, when the Saudis started talking about this, they should have said, no, really bad idea, man. Hire a PR firm, hand him $1 billion, and destroy his reputation worldwide.
Mm-hmm.
Don't kill him. Don't turn him into a martyr. Don't do this. Anyway, but no, it would be madness for us to destroy our relationship with the Saudis.
And so, what do you suppose that the policy people in, I would say CIA or National Security Council or even in the Senate, what kind of discussions are they having? Like, okay, we have found where Mohammed bin Salman sent 11 text messages to the head of the group that was dispatched to render Khashoggi, and apparently things went sideways, so they just went ahead and killed him. And so they're trying to really attribute these text messages to the fact that bin Salman knew that this murder was going to happen. But then again, we've got Putin, who has ordered the death of I don't know how many journalists. There were 3 journalists that were just killed in Africa, 2 months ago. We obviously had the polonium case and the Novichok case in Britain. He's killed dissidents in Moscow proper. We've got internment camps and death camps in China, but yet we have to keep hanging with President Xi. So what the heck?
Right. Yeah, it's all context. There's another factor here that people should be aware of, is that the Iranians have a massive and very, very effective propaganda and disinformation apparatus worldwide. They push stories, fan stories, and steer public opinion in ways that are almost unimaginable. So I'm not trying to make the case that everybody who's upset about Khashoggi is somehow now an Iranian agent. I'm just saying that there is, in fact, a major factor here in how much news play this is getting. That you have literally a very well-funded worldwide network of media outlets that work directly for Tehran and that are fanning these flames. The extent to which these guys are effective is sometimes, I don't know if it's both terrifying and silly, like the things that they actually convince people are true. A couple of years ago, the Iranians actually managed to sell the Pakistanis on the idea that the Israelis were threatening them, and got, I can't remember who it was, the Minister of Defense, a senior Pakistani official, to make a formal announcement that he was threatening to stage a nuclear strike on Israel in response. They actually got this to the point where the Pakistani government was threatening to nuke Tel Aviv over something that was a complete fabrication, a complete propaganda effort. Obviously, the Iranians probably never in their wildest dreams believed it could be that successful. But it's no joke. It is a real machine. And you can see it every day with the stories about Yemen. Right?
Yes,
Yemen is a war between proxies. It's a war between Saudi Arabia and its proxies and the Iranians and its proxies, straight up fighting for control of Yemen. And yet the Iranians have very successfully sold, actually, a large portion of the American media on the idea that Saudi Arabia is the aggressor and the poor Yemenis are on the receiving end. And you can't see all the arms that are coming in by ship, and you can't see the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps guys, and you're supposed to ignore the fact that the Houthis have fired missiles at American warships and Saudi oil tankers. No, they're somehow victims in all this. And amazingly enough, you can watch large portions of the American news media and hear that story regurgitated every day. That's how effective they are.
Indeed so. And so if we travel on over to Russia, Crimea, and Ukraine has lost 13,000 people in this. I don't even know what kind of a war it is, but I mean, it's clearly a ground war. And Yet it doesn't seem that anybody wants to shame Putin since the annexation of Crimea, where he has said, oh, nobody did anything. There's no consequence. So we're going to do this with his little green men, or Soviet loyalists, as I call them. And we have this major confrontation between the Russians in the Kerch Strait and Ukraine. And where is the outrage on that one?
Well, it depends on what you want for outrage. If you want a whole stack of press statements by the foreign minister of name any European country in which he says he is deeply disturbed, or she says she is deeply disturbed, got those about 3 feet high. If you want something that actually translates into help for the Ukrainians who are face to face with the bear, there's nothing. I mean, the reality for the Ukrainians is they're one hell of a lot closer to Vladimir Putin than they are to anybody in Western Europe. And while everybody kind of wants them to stay independent of Putin, nobody really seems inclined to put any skin in the game.
Mm-hmm.
So, and Vladimir is very good at calculating. I mean, he's been doing this for 4 years now, this kind of grinding hybrid war they do between cyber attacks and proxies and special operations and periodically limited amounts of conventional force, and just chewing away at Ukraine and taking chunks away from it and weakening it, and along the way serving an example to everybody else in that part of the world. But this is what happens if you think the Americans and Europeans are your new friends. Remember who's your next door neighbor. So that's where we are. Donald Trump has, to his credit, been actually has started down the road of giving the Ukrainians some actual real material aid, which Barack Obama would never do, which may slowly impact things. But in the meantime, the reality is the Germans, the French, the rest of Eastern Europe are not prepared to go to war with Vladimir Putin over Ukraine, which is way out there in the steppe.
Yeah, because we have this cockamamie pipeline that we're concerned about too. But Poroshenko said something kind of interesting last week, Sam, and that was that the 24 sailors were taken back to Russia and they're being put up on trial. And so Poroshenko says that they are now, he considers those 24 sailors as being prisoners of war. I almost think that's an accurate statement. And yet nobody seems to side with him on that statement. So is it a measure too far, or was he accurate?
Well, I think he's accurate. I might take it a step further. I'm sure they even qualify as being held as prisoners of war. It's more like they've been criminally kidnapped. I mean, there's no formal state of hostilities, and all I know that the Ukrainians were trying to do when their ships were seized was pass through a strait regarding which there is an international treaty that gives them that right. So I mean, the Russians don't have any, they don't have
dominion.
They don't. They're not. This is not about legalities. This is just the way they are. I mean, Putin is always the same, just like the rest of it. I mean, he's just going to take what he can take at any particular point in time. He's going to push, grab, weaken where he can, and he's made a pretty, in some ways, a pretty wise calculation for him that his interest in the West in going to war over Kiev is not real high. It's not critical to, Western Europe doesn't look at what's happening in Ukraine and think, my God, we've got to rush to the defense of the Ukrainians. Good Lord, we couldn't even get them to go into the Balkans 20 years ago when genocide was occurring on their doorstep. So this is how much showing up in Ukraine.
So what is the White House National Security Council? What kind of discussions or questions do you think that they're having? And, when they need to get some information from CIA, what are they really asking for? Do you have any kind of concept on what kind of discussions we need to have going forward, since at the G20, Trump refused to meet with Putin?
Well, I don't think it's an intel thing. I think it's a question of political calculus, right? And my position, I think you and I have talked about this many times before, is that the Russians are who they are, and none of that is going to change. Mm-hmm. They're not your friends. They're not necessarily your enemies if it's not in their interest. They're just going to do whatever Vladimir Putin and his buddies judge is best for Russia at one point in time. And on those random instances where it aligns with us, awesome. And in those instances, which are much more numerous, where their interests do not align with us, there's no way in hell they're going to help you or talk about helping you or anything else. They just forget it. So, and then you just make your own judgment, United States of America, where it is important enough to confront them and where basically you don't care. I would suggest it is important for us to help the Ukrainians. Vladimir is very good at kind of this hybrid war, keeping things below the radar. We can play that game as well. We don't have to send the 1st Cavalry Division to Kiev to confront Putin. We can arm the Ukrainians, train the Ukrainians, help them with cyber capabilities. We can do all of this stuff as well or better than the Russians and confront them at their own game. And honestly, I think it's not only the right thing to do, it's a smart thing to do because it makes them pay a price for what he's doing. It makes them have consequences for his actions. This seems like it was painless, but now it's not painless because this is going to cost you a lot of money and a lot of resources, Vladimir. And by the way, this is on your border, 10,000 miles from the shores of the United States. The stakes here are a hell of a lot higher to you. If something bad happens to Ukraine, frankly, it doesn't hurt us a whole hell of a lot. But my God, this is critical to you. You never know when that kind of pressure against Putin becomes invaluable someplace else.
When I kind of look at all these conflicts, I mean, we're supposed to be in these talks with the Taliban. That now we're bringing in, I think Pakistan. We want to inject them into the conversation. Then, you're speaking certainly of the protests and whatnot that is going on in Iran. We have the complete mess in our own hemisphere with Central America and Latin America and the impact that it has on our southern border. I just don't see that things are necessarily, I don't know. I can't find a plan. I can't find a plan at all. It seems like everybody else is on the ball field and the United States is still in the locker room suiting up.
Yeah, well, I think that honestly, that the president, when he talks about foreign policy and national security, I think the essence of what he says, I agree with 100%. In that we need a unifying principle for our national security and foreign policy, and that needs to be American national interest, not nation building, not gallivanting around, not sort of drifting into conflicts and then kind of drifting out, not getting mired down places and then 20 years later trying to figure out why are we still there. Like, we need a sharp, laser-like, hard-nosed focus. What's good for the United States of America, and then, of course, implicitly, its allies. And then, that ought to be the driving principle, and everything ought to be subjected to that lens. So, Afghanistan, okay. If we're in Afghanistan at this point, it's to prevent it. Same reason we went there to start with. So we don't leave it as a terrorist breeding ground in a place that will threaten our national security. So therefore, what we care about in those negotiations and in the prosecution of the war is an end state that leaves us safe. So all the bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. that want to, pave roads or build schools or do whatever, I'm not saying if it doesn't feed that end state, then why the hell are we doing it? Why? And just take that same template and apply it everywhere else. Okay. our goal is, at the border, this mess. I mean, it's what's the goal? The safety and the peace and prosperity of American citizens. Not any of this other stuff that's floating around. That ought to be the laser-like focus of everything we do. I agree with you that I am not at all convinced that even 2 years into this administration that we have actually assembled a national security team that is successfully in control of the whole federal government and driving it that way. Mm-hmm. Part of that, I think, is with resistance within the bureaucracy, and part of that is people learning on the job, and who knows what else. I also don't feel on any given day we're necessarily firing on all cylinders.
Yeah, and I don't think that we seem to have, as we're going through the entire funeral process for Bush 41, we're hearing about his histories of, coalition nations that are coming along with the United States. I don't see that Britain is doing too much. Just, where's Theresa May? I don't see she and Trump talking every day. And, Macron, he's got his own problems now. He may actually end up losing his job. But, you got Merkel and, where's Italy? And it's kind of nuts. We're still out here kind of all by ourselves, aren't we?
Yeah, well, to a certain extent, we always will be, because that just goes with the territory of being the big dog. But there is a huge amount of this that involves just the nuts and bolts of coalition building and working with allies. The reality is, the president can say whatever he's going to say, and this president and the other president, and he can have the clearest possible vision, essentially, of where we're going. And then you got this giant apparatus of the federal government, and you got to actually be able to take control of that thing and have that entire giant machine moving in concert. The ambassador in London, the ambassador in Berlin, the people down at the Department of State, DOD, everywhere else, they all got to be singing from the same song sheet. We got to be moving in the same direction. Mm-hmm. That is definitely not happening right now.
I just don't see it either.
You talk to the Department of State, but on any given day, you're talking to people who are actively in opposition to this president and doing everything they can to obstruct his policy. So forget about not having a song sheet. They've got their own, and they're totally different teams. So we are a long way from that.
A long way. Well, ladies and gentlemen, big round of applause to Sam Faddis for, I guess kind of validating what I'm feeling. And I was kind of hoping you'd change my mind, but that didn't work out. And I normally, when we have these conversations, I know I normally make you mad. But thank you for joining us on the Denise.
That's true. All right.
And ladies and gentlemen, it was a pleasure being with you. We'll see you again very soon.